Have you ever felt like you're carrying a storm inside you, a storm no one else can see, but it rages within you, quietly, fiercely, endlessly? Maybe it's the simmering anger when someone cuts you off in traffic, or the knot of anxiety before a conversation you're dreading, or perhaps it's the loneliness that creeps in, even when you're surrounded by people. Negative emotions are like invisible storms. They swirl through our hearts and minds, coloring the way we see the world, and often, we don't even realize how much control they have over us. In today's world, a world of endless deadlines, constant notifications, and mounting expectations, these emotions aren't just occasional visitors. There are constant companions, and what's worse, we've been trained to either suppress them or drown in them. We tell ourselves to get over it, or stay positive, but beneath the surface, the storm keeps brewing, and every now and then, it erupts, in a harsh word, in a sleepless night, in a decision we regret. But what if there was another way, a way to not only recognize these storms but to understand them, to ride them, and eventually, to dissolve them? For over 2,500 years, Buddhism has explored the nature of the human mind more deeply than perhaps any other tradition. It doesn't ask us to deny our emotions, it doesn't demand that we push them away. Instead, it invites us to turn towards them, to witness them, to question them, and, ultimately, to transform them. Negative emotions are not our enemies, they're messengers. Each one carries a lesson about who we are, what we cling to, and what we fear. The Buddha taught that suffering begins when we cling to fleeting things, mistaking them for permanent. Our emotions, like everything else in life, rise and fall, appear and disappear. But when we identify with them, when we believe, "I am angry," rather than "anger is here," we let the storm take over, we drown in it. Think about it for a moment. When was the last time you truly noticed your emotions, not by reacting to them, but by simply observing them? Most of us live on autopilot, reacting, resisting, and repeating. We get angry, and we lash out, we feel hurt, and we retreat, we become anxious, and we spiral. But what if we could pause, take a single mindful breath, and watch these emotions rise and fall like waves on an ocean? What if, instead of being swept away, we could learn to float, to find stillness in the storm? This is where the wisdom of Buddhism begins, not in distant temples or ancient scrolls, but right here, in the ordinary, messy, beautiful, painful moments of our daily lives. The Buddha once said, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." And when our minds are clouded with unexamined anger, fear, jealousy, and grief, we suffer. Not because these emotions exist, but because we don't know how to hold them, how to let them pass. In Buddhism, this unawareness is called avijja, or ignorance. It's the root of our suffering, and when we don't understand our minds, we're trapped by them. We become prisoners of our own storms, but there is a way out. It begins with awareness, a simple but radical act of turning inward, to become curious about what we're feeling, instead of running from it, to learn how to sit with discomfort, without letting it drown us. Over the next chapters, we'll explore how Buddhism teaches us to deal with negative emotions, not by denying them, not by indulging them, but by meeting them with clarity, wisdom, and compassion. We'll uncover where these emotions come from, why they arise, and how they bind us, and more importantly, how we can set ourselves free, because beyond the storm, there's a sky of unshakable peace. And no matter how fierce the winds inside you may seem right now, remember this: the storm is not you, you are the sky. But to navigate a storm, we first need to understand what it is. We need to ask, what exactly are these negative emotions? Where do they come from? And are they really what we think they are? Let's begin with something simple, yet profound. In Buddhism, emotions aren't labeled as good or bad in the way we often think. They're seen as mental formations, or cetasika in Pali, temporary patterns that arise in the mind due to causes and conditions. Imagine your mind like a vast, open sky. Emotions are like clouds, some are light and gentle, some are heavy and stormy. But none of them stay forever, and yet, the mistake we often make is believing those clouds define the sky. We let a passing feeling of anger or sadness convince us that we are angry, or are broken, but as the Buddha wisely pointed out, nothing arises without a cause, and nothing exists independently. Your anger isn't you, your fear isn't you, they're visitors. So what causes these visitors to appear? Buddhism teaches that negative emotions arise from three unwholesome roots, known as the three poisons: greed, lobha, the desire for more, for things to go our way, for people to behave as we wish; hatred, dosa, the urge to push away what we dislike, to destroy, to resist; delusion, moha, the ignorance of how things truly are, the misunderstanding of impermanence, of interconnection. When these roots take hold in our minds, emotions like jealousy, anger, anxiety, and despair begin to grow. But here's the important part: these emotions don't appear out of nowhere, they arise because of our attachments, our craving for control, our insistence that life conform to our preferences, and our belief that we are a solid, unchanging self. Let's take anger, for example. On the surface, anger might seem simple: someone insults you, and you feel angry. But Buddhism invites us to look deeper. Why do you get angry? Is it because of the words themselves, or because those words threaten the image you hold of yourself, because they made you feel small, disrespected, or powerless? If you didn't cling to the idea of me, mine, and my worth, would those words still hurt the same? Or take anxiety. We often feel anxious about the future, about outcomes we can't control, but the root of that anxiety is our craving for certainty, for guarantees in a world that offers none. We forget the simple truth of impermanence, that everything is in constant motion, including our emotions. What Buddhism reveals is this: negative emotions are not flaws in your character, they're not punishments, they're natural responses produced by an untrained, unaware mind, a mind that clings, a mind that resists, a mind that forgets its true, spacious, luminous nature. And because of this forgetfulness, we mistake emotions for permanent truths. We say, "I am sad," instead of "sadness is here." We say, "I am hopeless," instead of "hopelessness has arisen." This shift in language, though subtle, changes everything. It creates space, space between you and the storm, space for awareness to enter, space for freedom to begin. The Buddha often used the analogy of a mirror. Our mind, in its natural state, is like a clear, flawless mirror, but emotions, both pleasant and unpleasant, are like dust that settles on its surface. When we don't clean the mirror, the dust accumulates, we stop seeing clearly, and we mistake the dust for the mirror itself. But no matter how thick the dust, the mirror underneath remains untouched. This is one of the most hopeful teachings in Buddhism. Your true nature is not destroyed by anger, it's not erased by anxiety, it's merely obscured. And the practice of mindfulness, wisdom, and compassion is like polishing that mirror, slowly, patiently, until its original clarity returns. So, what are negative emotions? Really, they are impermanent, conditioned mental states, arising from causes, often rooted in attachment, aversion, and ignorance, that pass away when those causes are removed. They are not punishments, they are not fixed parts of who you are. They are opportunities, opportunities to wake up, opportunities to see your attachments, your fears, your misconceptions, opportunities to grow in awareness, patience, and compassion, both for yourself and others. And here's the truth: the storm will come, but when you understand its nature, you no longer fear it, you no longer drown in it, you watch it rise, you watch it pass, and little by little, you learn to remain calm while the winds howl around you. In our last chapter, we uncovered a powerful truth: negative emotions are not fixed, not permanent, and not who you truly are. They're passing mental states, born from conditions, destined to fade. But if that's true, then what exactly are those conditions? Where do these emotions come from? Why do some people seem naturally calm while others feel like they're always one trigger away from falling apart? To answer that, we have to go deeper, beneath the surface. Buddhism teaches us that our present emotions are the visible tip of something much larger and older, a vast, tangled web of habitual patterns, attachments, and unconscious beliefs. Imagine an ancient tree. On the surface, you see its leaves and branches, the obvious emotions, but those leaves are fed by unseen roots buried deep in the soil. Unless you address the roots, the same leaves will keep growing back. And what are those roots? Buddhism describes 3 fundamental poisons at the heart of human suffering: greed, lobha, our craving, our endless hunger for more pleasure, more recognition, more control; hatred, dosa, our aversion to pain, discomfort, and anything that threatens our ego; delusion, moha, our confusion about the nature of reality, our refusal to see things as they truly are. These 3 don't exist in isolation, they intertwine, feeding one another like roots of a tree, giving rise to countless emotions: anger, jealousy, fear, anxiety, and despair. Greed makes us chase fleeting pleasures, believing they will fill the emptiness inside. When we don't get what we want, hatred flares up, frustration, resentment, blame, and all the while, delusion blinds us to the fact that nothing outside of us can truly satisfy an inner need. This cycle continues, moment after moment, lifetime after lifetime. Let's look at a simple example. Imagine you're at work, and a colleague receives praise for something you secretly believe you deserve. You feel a surge of irritation, maybe even jealousy. On the surface, it seems like a minor, passing emotion, but underneath, what's really happening? There's greed, a craving for validation and recognition. There's hatred, a rejection of the fact that someone else received what you wanted, and there's delusion, the belief that your worth is tied to external approval, rather than being inherent and unshakable. This tiny moment reflects a much deeper pattern: the mind's tendency to grasp, to push away, to misunderstand, repeating itself endlessly. What makes this even trickier is that most of us aren't aware these roots exist. We see the anger, but we don't trace it back to its source. We feel anxious, but we never ask what belief is fueling that fear, and so, the same emotions resurface, again and again. The Buddha compared this to carrying a burning ember in your hand, hoping to throw it at someone else, but in the end, you're the one getting burned. That's the tragic irony of negative emotions. They arise because we're trying to protect ourselves, but they only deepen our suffering. The good news is this: once we see the roots, we gain the power to transform them. In Buddhist practice, this starts with mindfulness, sati, the simple, courageous act of noticing what's happening inside without judgment. When anger arises, don't suppress it, don't indulge it, just notice. Oh, anger is here. Then, gently ask, where did you come from? You might discover it stems from fear, or wounded pride, or an old memory you thought you'd forgotten, and every time you trace an emotion back to its root, its grip weakens. The Buddha taught that all things arise from causes and conditions. And when those causes are removed, the effects disappear. Your jealousy isn't inevitable, your anxiety isn't your identity, they're results of certain inner conditions, beliefs, attachments, misunderstandings. And through awareness, wisdom, and compassion, those conditions can change. Imagine a forest fire. At first glance, it seems uncontrollable, devastating. But if you cut off its fuel, the dry wood, the dead leaves, the flames will eventually die down. In the same way, if you stop feeding your negative emotions with unchecked craving, blind resistance, and false beliefs, they too will lose their power. It doesn't happen overnight. These roots are ancient, but every moment of awareness is like pulling out a small thread from a tangled knot. And over time, the knot begins to loosen. So far, we've traced our negative emotions to their ancient roots, those hidden patterns of craving, aversion, and delusion. But how do we actually face them in the heat of the moment? When anger surges, when anxiety tightens your chest, when jealousy creeps in quietly, what can you do? This is where Buddhism offers one of its most transformative teachings: mindfulness and awareness. Now, let's be honest, today, the word mindfulness gets thrown around a lot. It's become a buzzword in apps, office wellness programs, and social media posts. But in its original Buddhist context, mindfulness, or sati in Pali, is far deeper than a relaxation technique. It's not about clearing your mind. It's not about escaping difficult emotions. It's about learning to stay present with whatever arises, without clinging, without pushing away, and without getting lost in it. The Buddha compared the mind to a vast sky, and emotions, they're just passing clouds, some dark and heavy, some light and fleeting. mindfulness is the ability to watch those clouds without believing you are them. When anger rises, you don't say, I am angry. You say, anger is present. See the difference? One identifies with the emotion, the other recognizes it as a temporary visitor. The Buddha compared the mind to a vast sky, and emotions, they're just passing clouds, some dark and heavy, some light and fleeting. Mindfulness is the ability to watch those clouds without believing you are them. When anger rises, you don't say, I am angry. You say, anger is present. See the difference? One identifies with the emotion, the other recognizes it as a temporary visitor. Let's explore how this works in practice. The Buddha taught a simple but powerful sequence. 1. Recognize. When a difficult emotion arises, the first step is simply to notice it. Don't judge it. Don't suppress it, just mentally acknowledge, this is anger. This is sadness. This is fear. By naming the emotion, you create a tiny space between yourself and the feeling, and in that space, wisdom can enter. 2. Accept. Next, allow the emotion to be there. This might sound counterintuitive. Why let something painful stay? But resisting or denying an emotion only makes it stronger. As the saying goes, what you resist, persists. Mindfulness invites you to sit with the discomfort. Like sitting by a stormy sea, knowing the waves will rise and fall on their own. 3. Investigate. Gently ask, where is this emotion coming from? What story is my mind telling right now? Is this pain rooted in craving, aversion, or delusion? This step isn't about overthinking, it's about seeing clearly. You might realize your irritation isn't really about your friend's comment, it's about your craving to always be right, or your fear of being overlooked. 4. Non-identification. Finally, remind yourself, this is not who I am. The emotion is real, but it's not your identity, it's a passing mental state, arising due to conditions, and destined to dissolve when those conditions change. The Buddhist monk and teacher Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully describes emotions as visitors. When anger comes knocking, you don't slam the door or invite it to stay forever, you simply open the door, greet it with awareness, and watch as it eventually leaves. He suggests saying to yourself, hello, my old friend anger. I see you're here. I will take good care of you. This tender attitude changes everything. It turns mindfulness from a mental trick into an act of deep compassion, both for yourself and the difficult parts of your experience. And here's something remarkable, modern neuroscience is now confirming what ancient Buddhists taught 2,500 years ago. Studies show that when you mindfully name an emotion as it arises, it activates the brain's prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for reasoning and self-awareness, and calms down the amygdala, the brain's alarm center. In other words, recognizing emotions helps regulate them, not by suppressing, not by escaping, but by turning toward them, fully present. Of course, this isn't easy at first. The mind loves to react impulsively, it loves its old patterns, but every moment you pause to be mindful, you're planting a seed, and those seeds, over time, grow into new habits, new ways of being. The Buddha taught that the mind is like a garden. If you constantly water the seeds of anger, fear, and craving, they'll flourish, but if you nourish the seeds of mindfulness, patience, and understanding, those are the qualities that will take root. And so the practice is simple: be aware. Stay curious. Don't cling. Don't reject. Over time, this creates a new relationship with your emotions. They no longer control you, they no longer define you, they become passing clouds in the vast, unshakable sky of your awareness. In our last chapter, we uncovered the practice of mindfulness, the art of recognizing emotions as they arise, observing them without judgment, and learning to release our tight grip over them. But mindfulness, as profound as it is only one part of the journey. The Buddha taught that to truly transform our negative emotions, not merely manage them, not simply endure them, but to transform them, we need two powerful allies: wisdom and compassion. They are the twin wings of awakening. Without one, the other cannot fully soar. Let's begin with wisdom. In Buddhist thought, wisdom, or prajna, isn't about intellectual knowledge, it's not about memorizing scriptures or reciting philosophies. Wisdom is the deep, lived understanding of how things truly are. It sees through the illusions of permanence, separateness, and ego. It recognizes that everything we experience, our emotions, our identities, even our suffering, is impermanent, conditioned, and ultimately without a fixed, independent self. And here's where it matters: when wisdom touches a negative emotion, something miraculous happens. Anger, for instance, thrives on the belief, I am right. You are wrong. I must defend myself. But wisdom whispers, this anger is arising due to conditions. It's not who you are, nor who they are. It's a passing event in the vast flow of life. When jealousy appears, fueled by the illusion of me versus you, wisdom gently reminds, we are all interconnected, subject to the same joys, fears, and uncertainties. And when grief feels overwhelming, wisdom teaches that while pain is natural, clinging to what has passed only deepens our suffering. It's not a cold detachment, it's a warm, spacious clarity, one that holds your pain tenderly, while gently loosening the knots of delusion that keep it in place. Now, wisdom alone, if left unbalanced, can become sharp, even indifferent. This is why the Buddha always paired it with compassion. In Pali, the word is karu, the open-hearted wish for all beings, including yourself, to be free from suffering, and it's compassion that softens the fierce gaze of wisdom. It's compassion that allows you to look at your own anger and say, ah, old friend. You're here because you're hurting. Let me hold you with care. It's compassion that lets you see another person's harsh words not as personal attacks, but as the expression of their own unseen wounds. The Buddha compared compassion to the rain, falling gently on all things, without discrimination. When combined, wisdom and compassion transform negative emotions not by fighting them, but by illuminating their true nature and offering them the healing embrace of understanding. So how do we cultivate these qualities? The Buddha offered countless practices, but let's explore two simple, profound ones. 1. The practice of reflective wisdom. Whenever a strong negative emotion arises, ask yourself, is this permanent? Does this emotion define who I truly am? What conditions gave birth to this feeling? You might realize your anger isn't a fixed part of your identity, it's a result of unmet expectations, past wounds, or momentary frustrations. Seeing this doesn't instantly dissolve the emotion, but it disarms its power. As Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully said, when you shine the light of awareness on anger, it begins to lose its grip. 2. The practice of compassionate intention. When facing a painful emotion, instead of reacting, pause and silently offer yourself kindness. Say to yourself, may I be free from this suffering. May I find peace. Then, extend it outward, may all beings suffering from anger find peace. May those burdened by fear be free. This simple shift turns the isolated, contracted energy of a negative emotion into an expansive, healing force. It reconnects you to the human experience we all share. And here's something remarkable: modern psychology confirms what ancient Buddhists knew. Studies in emotional intelligence and compassion training show that people who cultivate self-compassion and reflective awareness respond to negative emotions with greater resilience, less reactivity, and deeper well-being. Brain scans reveal that loving-kindness meditations, which cultivate compassion, strengthen the areas of the brain associated with empathy, emotional regulation, and positive affect. In short, compassion doesn't make you weak. It makes you wise, steady, and deeply human. So the next time anger burns in your chest, the next time anxiety swells in your gut, remember this: you hold within you the capacity for both wisdom and compassion. You have the ability not just to endure your emotions, but to transform them, turning poison into medicine, turning darkness into light. This is not some distant ideal reserved for monks in remote monasteries. It's a living, breathing practice, available to you right now. In our last chapter, we spoke about wisdom and compassion, the two wings of transformation, how they help us recognize, hold, and ultimately dissolve our negative emotions with grace and understanding. But theory, no matter how beautiful, must be lived to become real, and the Buddha, ever the practical teacher, offered not just philosophy, but practices, time-tested techniques designed to meet us exactly where we are. Right here, right now, in the messy, beautiful, stressful, demanding. Rhythm of modern life. So how do we bring these teachings off the cushion and into the boardroom, into traffic jams, late-night anxieties, heated arguments, and sleepless nights? How do we carry the calm of the monastery into the chaos of the city? The answer lies in simple, powerful practices you can weave seamlessly into your daily routine. Let's explore them together. 1. Mindful breathing. The anchor within. The breath is always with us. It's our constant, silent companion. In Buddhist tradition, the practice of anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, is one of the oldest and most effective tools for calming the mind and centering ourselves. And the best part? You don't need a special room, cushion, or incense. You only need a moment of awareness. The technique is simple. Pause. Close your eyes if you can. Take a deep, conscious breath in. Notice the cool air entering your nostrils. Feel your chest gently rise. Exhale slowly, fully. Notice the warmth of the air leaving your body. Repeat. Just 3 conscious breaths can shift your entire state of being. The Buddha taught, when you know how to breathe, you know how to live. Modern science agrees. Research from Harvard shows that mindful breathing lowers stress hormones, improves focus, and reduces emotional reactivity in just minutes. So, the next time anger flares, anxiety tightens your chest, or sadness clouds your mind, return to the breath. It's your home base, your sanctuary within. 2. Name it to tame it. The power of labeling emotions. Another practical technique rooted in mindfulness is the simple act of naming your emotion. When a negative feeling arises, instead of suppressing or acting on it, gently say to yourself, this is anger, this is fear, this is sadness. In Buddhist practice, this is called noting. Why does it work? Because when you label an emotion, you shift activity from the reactive, survival-focused part of your brain to the rational, reflective areas. You create a moment of space, a sacred pause, where awareness can enter. Neuroscientist Daniel Siegel calls this technique name it to tame it. And it works beautifully. 3. The loving kindness, metta, practice. Healing through connection. Negative emotions often trap us in isolation. Anger, jealousy, shame. They convince us we are alone in our suffering. The Buddha countered this with the metta bhavana, the cultivation of loving kindness. A simple, heart-opening practice. Find a quiet space, close your eyes, take a deep breath. Silently repeat. May I be happy, may I be safe, may I be free from suffering. Then extend it to others. May you be happy, may you be safe, may you be free from suffering. Then to all beings, everywhere. It may feel strange at first, but in time, it softens the heart's defenses, heals emotional wounds, and dissolves the walls we build around ourselves. Studies have shown regular loving-kindness meditation boosts positive emotions, reduces anxiety, and enhances social connection. And in a world increasingly divided, that's a revolutionary act. 4. Walking meditation. Finding peace in motion. Not all meditation requires sitting still. In fact, some of the most profound insights come while moving. Walking meditation, or kinhin, is a practice where every step becomes a conscious act of presence. How to do it? Find a quiet path, walk slowly. With each step, silently say, I have arrived. As your foot touches down, I am home. As the other foot moves forward, feel the earth beneath your feet, the movement of your body. The simple miracle of walking. It turns ordinary moments, a walk to your car, a stroll through a park, into opportunities for peace. 5. The pause. Mastering the sacred second. Perhaps the most practical technique of all. The pause. Before replying to that angry text. Before reacting to a harsh word. Before reaching for distraction when discomfort arises. Pause. Take a single conscious breath. Feel your feet on the ground. Check in with yourself. That 1 second can mean the difference between a regrettable reaction and a mindful response. The Buddha said, a moment of patience in a moment of anger saves 1,000 moments of regret. And in modern life, where everything demands immediacy, this ancient wisdom is more precious than ever. These are not complicated rituals. They require no robes, no mantras, no temples, just your presence, your breath, your heart. They are practices for real people, in real lives, with real struggles, because Buddhism isn't an escape from life. it's a deeper embrace of it. We've traveled a long road together, haven't we, from the invisible storm of overwhelming feelings, to the roots beneath the surface, from mindfulness and awareness, to the transformative power of wisdom and compassion, and finally, to practical ways we can bring these teachings into our busy, modern lives. Now, we arrive at the calm after the storm, the peaceful space that emerges when we no longer resist or are controlled by negative emotions. But what does it truly mean to live beyond negative emotions? Is it to be free from all pain, to become perfectly happy, perfectly peaceful, perfectly serene? Buddhism does not promise a life without suffering, rather, it offers a freedom that transcends suffering, a deep liberation that even in the face of storms. The sky within remains vast and clear. Imagine a vast ocean, storms come and go, waves rise, thunder roars, lightning flashes, but the ocean itself remains unshaken beneath. This is the heart of Buddhist practice, to cultivate a mind as vast and steady as the ocean, unperturbed by passing waves. When negative emotions arise, we no longer see them as enemies or threats, we see them as clouds passing across the sky. They may temporarily obscure the sun, but the sun is always there, and in this space of calm awareness, something beautiful unfolds. You discover that your true self is not the angry voice, the anxious heart, or the sorrowful mind. You are the awareness in which these emotions arise and pass away. From this place of clarity, you can respond to life with greater patience, kindness, and resilience. You become a living example of peace in a turbulent world. This is not an abstract ideal or a distant goal, it is a life you can begin to live right now, moment by moment. Each breath, each pause, each act of compassion brings you closer to this freedom. And as you walk this path, you inspire others to find their own calm after the storm, because the true revolution is quiet, subtle, and deeply personal. It begins within, in the gentle unfolding of awareness, wisdom, and love. Thank you for journeying with me through this exploration of how Buddhism helps us handle negative emotions. May these teachings serve as a light in your darkest moments, a balm for your wounded heart, and a guide toward lasting peace. Remember, the storm may rage outside, but inside, the calm is always waiting. Stay present. Stay compassionate, and above all, stay kind, to yourself, and to all beings. This is the calm after the storm. This is your true nature.